Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a collection of analysis, really a synthesis of 10 cases put together by scientific analyst Justin Lake. And it's all unified under this deeply provocative title, The Machinery of Moral Performance.
That title is so critical. It
Yeah.
really is, because it immediately confronts what he sees as this fundamental disconnect in our society.
A disconnect. How so?
Well, Lake's sources, they suggest that we all believe our legal systems, our social structures, they operate on these bedrock principles.
Right, like evidence, due process, rational morality, the stuff we're taught in civics class.
Exactly. But what he uncovers is a reality where spectacle,
Mhm.
it just frequently overtakes substance. The performance becomes the point.
And that's Lake's central argument, isn't it? The one he weaves through every single case. That the system's true priorities are institutional self-preservation.
Yes, that's a huge part of it. Self-preservation, asserting its own authority, and just managing public perception.
It's rampant virtue signaling, basically.
That's the perfect phrase for it. So for you listening, if you're looking for a comprehensive but, a quick way to get to the heart of Lake's conclusions, this is it. He reveals how the very structures designed to deliver justice courts, government agencies, local authorities often end up prioritizing their own bureaucratic ego.
And rigid procedural adherence. Doing things by the book, even if the book is leading you off a cliff.
Precisely.
Okay.
And that comes at the expense of the complex, nuanced, and frankly, the ethical outcomes that true justice actually demands.
So our mission today is to trace that tension. Why does justice, which should be tethered to principles, to verifiable evidence, and due process, why does it so easily collapse into spectacle?
Into raw emotion and pure moral performance.
Yeah. Lake uses these 10 distinct cases not as, random events, but as consistent data points. And they all build towards one pretty devastating conclusion about the state of modern accountability. Let's start exactly where Lake starts, because I think the most chilling part of his analysis is how these massive systemic failings, they begin in the most routine, almost petty conflicts of our everyday lives. Lake calls it the seepage of authority.
A seepage of authority. And that phrase, it's profound because it shows that government power isn't just confined to, big constitutional issues or major crises.
It's not just for emergencies.
Not at all. It's constantly infiltrating the ordinary interactions between citizens. Think about it. Neighbor disputes, routine financial disagreements, family conflicts.
Boundary issues.
Things that are fundamentally, relational or civil matters?
They're supposed to be. But Lake argues that the moment the state gets involved, these disputes are immediately elevated. They get weaponized. They turn into these legal and moral traps for everyone involved. Okay, and what's the mechanism? How does a simple argument become a trap?
It's the system's absolute dependence on procedural adherence. That's the key. It actively works to divorce the dispute from its context.
So an officer or, say, an administrative agency, they get a call.
And they're trained to respond to provocation, not the messy, complicated backstory that generated the conflict over, months or even years.
The history just gets erased.
Completely. And Lake is so insistent on this point. Procedural adherence, which on the surface is meant to, maintain order, it often acts as an accelerant. It actually escalates the conflict rather than mitigating it.
Can you give us an example of that?
Sure. Think of a long-standing property boundary argument. Let's say one party physically pushes the other's fence over the line. The second party reacts, maybe they push back.
Seems like a pretty human reaction.
A very human reaction.
Yeah.
But the officer arrives and sees only the physical confrontation. The history, the rightful ownership of the boundary, the original provocation, it all just disappears under the weight of a potential assault charge.
And the system is just built to punish the breaking of a rule, any rule, without caring about why it was broken.
That's it. Which leads us directly to the profound unfairness that Lake highlights. The citizen who is simply acting in self-defense or just asserting their rightful property boundaries is often the one who gets criminalized.
So they're the ones forced into compliance, arrested, or fined.
While the original provocateur, the one who knowingly started the whole thing, is shielded by the very chaos of the bureaucratic response they initiated.
The irony there is just brutal.
It's incredibly brutal. Lake notes that the victim often becomes the defendant because their ethical, assertive action, their refusal to just roll over for the aggressor, is interpreted by the system as a violation of procedure.
Wow.
So the core takeaway from this first part of his analysis is unmistakable. Morality, ethical reasoning, doing the right thing, it's all rendered totally irrelevant the moment it conflicts with bureaucratic authority.
The landscape rewards silence.
Silence and compliance. And it swiftly punishes anyone who asserts their rights in a way that challenges that established order. It's control, plain and simple, just disguised as procedure.
So it sounds like the bureaucratic process itself becomes a weapon.
A very effective one.
If a government entity or even just an antagonist knows they can drag you into a procedure that demands your compliance, they win just by exhausting your resources and forcing you to shut up.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Lake details how these seemingly benign procedural tools, things like non-fault restraining orders or mandatory administrative audits, are weaponized. The goal isn't to achieve justice.
It's just to assert the ego of the institution.
It's to make the citizen feel the weight of authority. It's conditioning them for the next level of systemic control.
Okay, so that culture of silence and compliance, the one that's forced on the individual in a small dispute. How does the legal system take that and just amplify it into total defeat?
Well, that's the next step.
Lake connects the dots right to the ultimate legal coercion mechanism, which he discusses in detail. It's the gambit of trial and plea. And this is where it gets really interesting, because this is where the system guarantees its victory without ever needing to prove its case.
This is the moment Lake shows the individual is backed into a truly impossible corner, an accused person. And this is regardless of how strong their case for innocence might be.
Right, the evidence could be on their side.
It doesn't matter. They face a brutal, almost existential choice. They can insist on their constitutional right to a trial, present their full, nuanced story. But that trial is costly, it's terrifying, and it carries the risk of a decades-long sentence. Or they can accept a plea deal.
And these deals are very carefully structured, aren't they? It's not a simple admission of guilt.
Not at all. Often it allows them to admit to a lesser charge, or sometimes admit nothing at all. It's called an Alford plea in some places.
Yeah.
They maintain a sort of technical legal innocence.
But they still have to surrender their freedom, their record, and ultimately their dignity. It's a coerced admission of defeat, even when the accused person knows, and maybe even the prosecutor suspects, that they're innocent.
And the lever that transforms the right to a trial into this devastating trap is the widespread use of mandatory minimum sentencing.
Okay.
Lake spends a lot of time on the judicial context here. Mandatory minimums, especially for certain crimes, are engineered to maximize fear. The stakes of losing at trial are raised so incredibly high that the risk becomes unacceptable, even for a demonstrably innocent person.
Can you walk us through the psychological math there, the calculation Lake identifies?
Absolutely. And the math is just devastatingly clear. Imagine you're innocent. You know you're innocent. But you also know that losing your trial carries a mandatory minimum sentence of, say, 25 years in prison.
25 years.
Versus taking a plea deal that guarantees you 2 years with eligibility for parole. The choice is no longer about guilt or innocence.
It's an economic decision. It's risk management.
It's pure management of catastrophic risk. The evidence of your innocence might exist, the facts might be on your side, but the threat of that extreme, disproportionate sentence, it just forces compliance, it forces silence, and ultimately it forces the suppression of the truth.
It's the institutional equivalent of holding a gun to the defendant's head.
That's a very good way to put it.
The system doesn't need to gather the evidence. The threat of the sentence is enough to secure what looks like a conviction.
And this is Lake's twofold conclusion about why the system loves the plea gambit. First, it gets a conviction. That's a statistical win for the prosecutor, a win for the state. And it gets it without ever needing to prove guilt with evidence in open court.
It completely bypasses judicial accountability and transparency.
Completely. And second, and this is the deeper, more sinister implication, it conditions citizen behavior. It perpetuates these cycles of fear and coercion. It embeds the idea that fighting the system, even when you are 100% in the right, is an irrational, self-destructive act.
So this mechanism is the purest expression of that bureaucratic ego we were talking about.
Yes, overriding the actual pursuit of justice. The system prefers a statistical win and a compliant public over the messy, time-consuming, and uncertain pursuit of factual truth.
So if the first section reveals how this machinery coerces compliance from individuals, Section 2 is the inevitable result. It's the macro-level evidence proving that these structural flaws aren't just, theoretical. They produce catastrophic, measurable human failures.
Exactly. We move now to the staggering cost of wrongful conviction. Lake uses this data to move beyond a philosophical argument and into a straight-up statistical indictment of the system.
And he points to a truly sobering, specific data point for 2024.
147. In 2024 alone, 147 prisoners were exonerated. That is a massive number of annual corrections. And when you quantify the collective time that was stolen, The figures just become incomprehensible.
It amounts to nearly 2,000 years of wrongful imprisonment, 2 full millennia of human life stolen by a system that was supposed to protect them. I mean, that's just an astronomical cost in lost liberty.
And Lake is determined not to let this stay as just an abstract number. He makes sure we see the faces behind the statistics. He names the specific victims of this systemic failure.
Like Carrie Max Cook.
Carrie Max Cook, who spent decades on death row. Sandra Hemi, who was recently exonerated after 43 years. 43 years, making her the longest-serving female exoneree in U.S. history.
And there were others he mentioned, Charlotte Playtez, Gilbert Merritt III.
Right. And his point is, these are not isolated errors. They're not one-in-a-million mistakes. They are proof of a machine that is fundamentally broken. It's running efficiently, sure, but it's running in the wrong direction.
The sheer existence and, frankly, the necessity of organizations like the Innocence Project.
Or the various conviction integrity units that are popping up in DA's offices.
Right. The fact that we need them at all is, as Lake argues, the ultimate indictment. These groups are dedicating massive resources simply to cleaning up the systematic failures of the primary machinery.
And the analysis doesn't just stop at listing victims. It goes deeper. It details the specific, recurring drivers of these injustices.
And they are what?
Rampant prosecutorial misconduct is a big one. That's where evidence is suppressed or distorted. Then there's the reliance on coerced and incentivized testimony.
Jailhouse snitches, things like that.
Exactly. And finally, the use of deeply flawed forensics, which are often presented to juries as though they're infallible science.
So Lake suggests that the fundamental failure is this. The system, as it's currently built, often fails to distinguish accusation from guilt.
And narrative from proof.
They built a machine that's dangerously efficient at generating convictions, driven by that fear and coercion we talked about, but it's catastrophically inefficient at generating justice.
And this isn't a new problem. This is why Lake pivots immediately to his next source, to emphasize that these failures are structural. They're not anomalies. They are long-standing systemic flaws baked into the judicial process that just repeat themselves generation after generation.
And to reinforce this, he draws on these critical historical examples, showing the terrifying consistency of the defects. He cites cases like Anthony Broadwater.
Broadwater was wrongfully convicted based on mistaken identity and, frankly, junk science.
Then there's the horrific, decades-long saga of the Ford Heights Four,
where clear, official misconduct led to 4 innocent men serving years and years in prison. And the tragic case of Anthony Porter, whose near execution was stopped only days before it was scheduled, revealing just deep institutional corruption.
So when you look across all these cases, the historical ones and the contemporary ones, the nature of the evidence failure is just strikingly consistent.
Incredibly consistent. Lake identifies 3 recurring types of defects. It's probably worth spending a moment on those because understanding the mechanism of failure is so essential to his argument.
Absolutely. What's the first one?
The first defect is false testimony. And this isn't just someone making a mistake on the stand. Lake focuses on testimony that's often derived from really questionable witnesses, like jailhouse informants who are heavily incentivized.
They're offered reduced sentences or special treatment in exchange for their testimony.
Exactly. The system effectively creates a perverse market for false evidence. It rewards lying if that lie leads to a conviction.
Okay, so that's the first one. What's the second?
The second is coerced confessions. Lake details how, particularly with vulnerable populations, people with intellectual disabilities, mental illness, or even just minors, the psychological pressure in interrogation rooms can be overwhelming.
These long, grueling interrogations.
Hours and hours, and leads to people admitting to crimes they didn't commit. The accused is just trying to escape the immediate psychological agony of the interrogation, and they'll sign away decades of their life just for a moment of peace.
And the third defect?
The third is the systemic problem of flawed evidence. This often involves forensic analysis that was later proven to be unreliable. It's junk science.
Like what?
Things like microscopic hair analysis, dog sniff evidence, or even faulty fingerprint identification that just lacked the rigorous scientific backing that we would demand today. Lake points out that for years, the courts just rubber-stamped these methods because they were presented by experts.
So it maintained the veneer of objective proof even when the science itself was completely shaky.
Exactly. And he uses a case like the Ford Heights Four as a devastating illustration of all 3 defects happening at once. You had coerced confessions, you had false testimony from an incentivized witness, and you had evidence, or a lack of it, that was mishandled or just ignored.
The failure wasn't a single weak link in the chain.
It was the entire chain collapsing due to structural rot. It shows how authority and narrative can completely overwhelm the search for objective fact.
So, if the mechanisms of authority and coercion force individuals into silence, and the system is demonstrably prone to prosecuting based on these flawed types of evidence, the next logical step in Lake's argument is to show how society itself embraces the narrative of guilt even when the evidence isn't there.
hmm The system produces chaos, and society looks for the easiest story to make sense of it all.
Okay, let's move to section 3, which really focuses on the corrosive effect of emotion and storytelling on what should be evidence-based reasoning. This starts with his analysis of moral panic over evidence.
Right. And what Lake is challenging here is society's immediate, almost enthusiastic willingness to accept an accusation as de facto guilt.
That eagerness.
That eagerness is the fuel for these cycles of injustice. When a moral panic sets in, which he defines as this intense feeling of threat that's driven by emotion, not by data, it immediately inflates the number of false positives
Society becomes desperate to identify a culprit.
and restore a sense of moral order. And in that desperation, they are more than willing to ignore or even actively erode process integrity. The focus shifts entirely away from the tedious work of due process.
To the satisfying rush of finding a target and controlling the narrative.
Precisely. And Lake circles right back to the systemic coercion we discussed earlier. He stresses that those mandatory minimums and plea deals, they ensure the accused is effectively punished before a trial even concludes.
It's pre-trial punishment, and that feeds directly into the moral panic.
It creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. When a system is engineered this way, it conditions the public to treat the accusation as an effective form of punishment, regardless of the merit of the actual claim.
And this massively empowers those who control the story.
Immensely. Prosecutors, investigators, even community leaders or social media activists. They know that the threat of the process alone is often sufficient to get a guilty result, even if they can't prove it.
Yeah.
The truth gets obscured the very moment the process itself becomes the penalty.
This brings us to a really profound philosophical and legal shift that Lake details next. Narrative as a proxy for evidence. If you're conditioning people and institutions to treat accusation as punishment, then you must also be conditioning them to treat a powerful story as sufficient fact.
That is the core danger he analyzes. He shows this institutional shift where social and legal systems start treating a compelling personal narrative, a powerful story of victimhood or wrongdoing, as sufficient for condemnation.
Entirely replacing the need for corroborated external proof.
Is the death of evidence, replaced by subjective interpretation.
But this raises a really sensitive question, and I'm sure Lake addresses it. Isn't he being a bit insensitive here? If personal trauma is real and overwhelming, how can we ask victims to produce corroborated proof, especially decades later when memory is hazy and evidence is long gone?
He is acutely aware of the sensitivity, but his focus remains on the integrity of the justice system itself. He's not arguing that trauma is unreal. He is arguing that trauma, however compelling it may be, is not a substitute for the evidentiary standard required for state-sponsored condemnation and punishment.
So his focus is on the mechanism of justice, which has to remain objective to protect everyone, including the innocent.
Exactly. He asserts that justice fundamentally requires external, verifiable facts to justify punishment. It has to be separate from the subjective emotional state of the accuser or the accused. If we abandon that objectivity, we abandon justice.
So he details the specific types of claims that are substituting for proof in modern contexts, the ones that make corroboration so difficult. The first is decades-old claims.
Right. They are incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to corroborate or refute objectively. It leaves the outcome often dependent purely on who is more believable.
Secondly, he analyzes what he calls shifting consent boundaries.
And this is where the legal or social understanding of a past event changes retrospectively. An act that may have been considered consensual or permissible at the time is now reinterpreted through a modern lens, resulting in condemnation years later.
Which is fundamentally problematic for due process. You're moving the goalposts after the game is over.
That's the issue. And the third, and maybe the most powerful element, is the weight of personal trauma, which is often used as a mechanism to bypass the evidentiary standard entirely. The emotional impact of the narrative becomes a proof itself.
And what's the danger there?
Lake warns that if we accept these narratives uncritically, without demanding external, verifiable fact, justice is fundamentally transformed into spectacle. Punishment gets meted out not because a verified wrongdoing occurred, but because of someone else's interpretation of an event.
An interpretation that's often highly emotional and subjective and comes years or decades later.
It strips the accused of the necessary protections of due process and reshapes lives based on memory and emotion, rather than concrete, verifiable fact.
It sounds like the system, having failed at its foundational task of telling proof from narrative, then moves seamlessly into the public sphere. And that's where moral performance takes over entirely, because that's where the rewards are.
The public wants to feel good, and the system wants to look good.
Okay, let's look at the performative side of morality that he details. Moral outrage as theater. This is where Lake shifts his analytical lens from the legal system to the social ecosystem. He specifically cites the Raja case as an example.
The Raja case, in his analysis, is critical. It functions as this pure social experiment that illustrates the dynamics of performative outrage. The condemnation wasn't proportional to the alleged transgression, it was magnified to serve a completely different social purpose.
The outrage becomes the performance. It's not focused on finding a proportionate remedy for whatever harm was committed.
Not at all. It's about signaling to the rest of the community, I am moral, I am ethically superior, and I'm on the correct side of this dispute.
And the immediate consequence of this, as Lake notes, is that the outrage just inflates, and justice collapses into simple vengeance.
The public starts confusing spectacle, this massive theatrical display of condemnation, with actual, verifiable accountability. The louder the outrage, the more people assume they're doing good.
What's fascinating here is the deeper psychological implication Lake explores. He talks about symbolic annihilation.
Yes, and he defines that as the systemic eradication of a figure's public, social, and professional standing beyond any legal or proportional consequence. And it's performed specifically to validate the observer's own moral position.
So the more extreme the condemnation.
The more morally secure the observers feel, he suggests it's a self-soothing mechanism that often masks deeper, more uncomfortable feelings. Professional envy, social insecurity, or maybe a fear of people who wield strength or controversy.
So by symbolically annihilating the target, the observer feels immediately elevated and safe from scrutiny themselves.
And proportionality is completely abandoned. The goal is no longer to fit the punishment to the crime, like a fine or probation. The goal is the complete erasure of the figure, just to assert the observer's own virtue and moral security.
Ethical reasoning just takes a back seat.
The performance is the priority. And if we look at the next source he analyzes, Lake shows how easily this theater of outrage can be weaponized into public policy, specifically through one powerful phrase.
For the children.
Exactly.
That phrase acts like a social sledgehammer, doesn't it? Lake notes that the rhetoric immediately suspends all critical skepticism and all due process.
If you dare to question a policy or demand evidence for some proposed intervention, you risk being labeled as someone who doesn't care for the children.
So public emotion dictates outcomes and policy, overriding critical thinking and any kind of measured deliberation.
And what begins as a well-intentioned concern is immediately warped into a potent tool for social control. Lake observes that under this umbrella, evidence becomes optional, suspicion becomes fact, and punishment is explicitly performed for optics.
The institution, whether it's a school board, a police department, a government agency, it needs to look like it's acting decisively and morally.
Even if that action is entirely ill-informed, disproportionate, or unjust, the imperative isn't to solve the problem, it's to satisfy the public's moral appetite.
And this results in a systemic bias toward reaction over reason.
And narrative over proof. If the public demands immediate, decisive moral action, the machinery will deliver a performance. It won't necessarily deliver results.
And this leads us directly to the Turpin family case, which Lake uses as this perfect, heartbreaking example of virtue signaling in practice.
The Turpin case is a devastating microcosm of the failure of moral performance versus actual genuine care. Lake highlights what he calls the binary narrative failure. The first part of the story was the satisfying optics.
Right. Authorities successfully rescued 13 siblings from horrific documented abuse. The public cheered, the media covered it. There was this tremendous, clear sense of moral victory and effective intervention.
The performance was flawless.
But, as Lake points out, the story didn't end with the rescue. Once the cameras left and the public's moral outrage had been satisfied and moved on, the long-term, nuanced needs of the victims were completely failed.
And by the very same system that had rescued them.
Yeah.
He details how the post-rescue care was just fractured. Foster placements and social services often failed to provide adequate long-term support, and this led to further neglect and trauma for the children.
And he also includes the often ignored fact that the parents themselves were suffering from significant mental health issues.
Which, while it doesn't excuse the abuse at all, it highlights a systemic failure to treat the root causes of this complex family situation. But the system was just thirsty for pure, unadulterated punishment.
So the system prioritized the appearance of morality, the dramatic public rescue, and the surge of condemnation, rather than ensuring the complex, expensive, and long-term well-being and effective intervention that was actually required.
It was a successful moral performance, but a catastrophic systemic failure in terms of actual effectiveness and ongoing justice.
It just confirms Lake's thesis completely. The machinery of performance rewards optics over the difficult, often invisible, and expensive work of genuine justice.
The virtue signaling satisfied the observers and the institutions involved. But the vulnerable people who needed protection were still neglected once they were out of the immediate spotlight.
We've covered a vast and frankly unsettling ground here. From the routine bureaucratic traps that crush individual rights to the grand spectacle of moral theater that satisfies public ego. So if we synthesize these 10 cases and observations, what's Lake's central pattern? What's the overall consequence?
The central pattern, as he meticulously documents, is chillingly consistent. Authority, raw outrage, and narrative performance consistently replace principle, verifiable evidence, and measured justice.
This isn't just a random set of unfortunate events.
Not at all. He argues it is the natural, systemic outcome of machinery that prioritizes its own image and self-preservation above absolutely everything else.
And the problem is rooted in this fundamental confusion, right? A confusion that's embedded in citizens and institutions alike. We confuse spectacle with accountability.
We really do. We feel a virtuous rush when we watch the moral posturing and the public fall of some figure, and that feeling substitutes for actual systemic improvement. We falsely conclude we fixed something just because we generated a massive public reaction.
And that confusion tragically dictates who bears the brunt of this machinery. Lake identifies two primary disproportionate targets.
That's right. On one hand, you have the visible, the controversial, or the powerful figures. They become these perpetual targets for symbolic annihilation. Their spectacular fall satisfies the public's need for moral performance and vengeance.
And on the other hand,
You have the vulnerable citizens without representation. The individual caught in those everyday financial or boundary disputes we talked about at the very beginning. They bear the quiet, disproportionate brunt of the machinery of compliance.
they have no powerful narrative to counter the relentless assertion of state authority.
They're simply crushed by procedure.
And the cycle, without proper checks and balances, is just fiercely self-reinforcing.
It is. Accusation quickly becomes punishment, virtue signaling successfully masquerades as protection, and slowly but surely, the rule of law erodes into nothing more than moral theater.
Lake's analysis is a comprehensive warning, then. If we continue to reward performance,
We will cease to value objective truth, and the system will just continue to generate injustice.
which brings us all the way back to Lake's conclusion. Justice is not a performance. It's not intended to satisfy public emotion.
It is a measured system. It's defined by principles, objective evidence, and scrupulous due process. It is hard, it is slow, and it often lacks that satisfying, immediate, emotional rush of outrage.
We have to fundamentally distinguish morality from spectacle.
Outrage from genuine accountability.
And most importantly, accusation from proof.
And if the machinery of law is ever going to serve its intended purpose, which is protecting the innocent while fairly addressing verified wrongdoing, that distinction has to be absolute. It has to be non-negotiable, even when the narrative is compelling and the emotion is high.
That is a staggering realization. We've seen how easy it is for appearances and raw emotion to outweigh verifiable truth across all levels of society, from a local police interaction to a grand televised moral drama. So if systems are rewarded for performative morality for making a big public show of intervention like the initial Turpin rescue, how can we possibly restructure accountability? How do we ensure that the long-term nuanced work of true justice, the often invisible administrative rigor and emotional support that lacks any spectacle whatsoever, how do we make sure that work is prioritized, funded, and ultimately rewarded?
That is the question, isn't it?
And that's something for you to mull over or explore on your own.